Greetings and welcome back to the podcast. This episode, we are joined by Mr. Brian Hamm, CEO of McDaniel, an industry-leading petroleum evaluations company that also provides consulting and research products for acquisitions and divestitures, carbon capture technology, and machine learning. Mr. Brian Hamm earned a Bachelor of Science degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Calgary and also holds a professional engineer designation with APEGA. Mr. Brian Hamm sits on the board of directors for the Calgary Petroleum Club and is the chair of the Canadian Energy Executive Association. Among other things, we discuss quality reservoir analysis, 20% discount rates, and North America's largest oil resource. Enjoy. This episode is brought to you by Ninepoint Partners and the Ninepoint Energy Fund. Ninepoint Partners manages unique alternative investment solutions that offer investors the benefits of better diversification. With over $8 billion in assets and institutional contracts and over 90 employees, Ninepoint is among the largest independent asset management firms in Canada. Learn more at ninepoint.com. This episode is brought to you by Galatea Technologies. Galatea is a software company based in Calgary that is focused on helping producers better manage their fluid logistics. Galatea enables field operators and truck drivers with the ability to make the optimal decision on every waste, water, or clean oil load, resulting in 20% savings on trucking and disposal costs. The Galatea platform makes it easy to create digital truck tickets, manifests, and shipping documents that automatically flow through the field data capture and finance systems. Galatea's platform is used by over 50% of Canadian producers, 600 trucking companies, and hundreds of disposal locations. Visit galateatech.com to learn more about how to optimize that last line on your lease op. This podcast episode is sponsored by Enverus. Enverus is the world's largest energy-dedicated software-as-a-service company committed to helping customers close the gap between data and value creation. Enverus has been supporting the Canadian energy industry for over 30 years. Visit Enverus.com for more details. Good morning, Mr. Brian Hamm. Thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate your time. I know it's valuable, but thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. I'm excited to have a chat.
You're the CEO of McDaniel, but what is McDaniel?
Yeah, so McDaniel is a consulting firm here in Calgary focused on energy and specifically on petroleum. And we're all about trying to find that balance between what's left in the ground and what's the value of what's left in the ground. And we're trying to come up with new and better ways to figure that out.
Engineer by training.
I went to U of C here and did mechanical engineering. I swore I would never work in oil and gas. I grew up in northern B.C. A lot of my friends and close relatives were connected to the industry. And for some reason, I just decided that wasn't going to be me. And then I came out of school and it was early 2000s and the market was amazing. And I got a great offer. I joined oil and gas right out of school at McDaniel, and the mix of something technical and something closer to finance was really intriguing to me. And, here I am almost 20 years later.
If the plan wasn't energy, what was the plan?
I honestly didn't know. I guess most kids growing up with Lego and taking mechanical engineering, I figured in a perfect world, I'd design race cars or something. But I always had a passion for finance. I was always intrigued by the markets and that in general. And so I actually, straight out of high school, I went and did a year or so of a finance degree, and I just found it extremely boring. And so my dad gave me some advice. He said, well, why don't you're always good at math and science. Why don't you just go do engineering? And so I did that. And, I learned that actually a lot of engineers end up splitting their time between real engineering, let's say, and finance and business. And so I think I found a happy mix here at McDaniel.
Why McDaniel?
I was happy to get any job I could get. And like I said, that mix of digging into something analytically and trying to understand something from kind of like an engineering or a math background was really interesting to me and challenging. But at the same time, it was also really cool to see how do these companies work and why are some companies better than other companies and why are some assets better than other assets and how does that translate through to the market's expected value of an entity. That was tying all that together was quite interesting to me.
These days, it's rare to spend most of your career at one company. It's also rare to make it to the top as CEO. What do you think led you down this path and maybe contributed to your success?
Yeah, I mean, as far as staying at one company, I mean, I can point to one person in particular, is Phil Welch, who was my predecessor. I think he was an incredible boss, and he ran an amazing place that really encouraged everybody to stick around. And, whether that was through fair compensation or simply the way his demeanor was to try to lead the team in a way that everybody felt like we were all on one big team. And that starts with comp and just basic little things, but it also goes all the way through to the model that he put in place, whereby pretty early on in your career at McDaniel, you become an owner and we work hard together. And, everyone says they work hard, play hard, but I think we really do here. That culture that Phil put in place while I was in my junior years really, really stuck. And so we've been very, very lucky at McDaniel. We've had almost everybody who starts here kind of dies here, if you will. Almost never hire anyone with experience. And that's kind of part of our mandate, is to build a team that's very, very tight and train them our way. And so that's kind of how we continue to do it this day. And then it's, as far as, making it to the top, I mean, I think I'd be remiss to say that, I don't have 4 exec partners who are very, very close to me as well. And we run a pretty flat executive team here at McDaniel. And the beauty of it is we all started within a year of each other and we've all progressed together. And the strength of that partnership has really led to a lot of positives for us.
On the subject of hard work and a flat organization, I think you responded to my email at about 10:30 last night directly as the CEO. So there must be, it's true.
Yeah, that continues. Unfortunately, we still, as much as we do play hard, I mean, certainly we're very busy in general. Normally in the old days, we wouldn't be very busy this time of year, but our business has changed a little bit from just being pure year-end reserve certification to involving a whole bunch of other little angles. And one of those angles is certainly our advisory arm, where we're advising on buy-side different acquisitions. And that's got us very busy at the moment. So there's lots of people answering emails at 10, 11 at night right now.
Maybe we'll get into McDaniel a little bit more, but to go back in time, a little bit of history on the company. Who was Rod McDaniel and why was he important to the company?
Yeah, so Rod was a reservoir engineer that started the firm in 1955. And this is at a time when I think Dr. Spruill also started his firm. And it was a time when there's a lot of new development going on. There was limited expertise, frankly, in the world, really, on reservoir engineering. It was maybe a 50-year history at that time. So Rod started the firm to offer independent advisory services to various producers on reservoir engineering. And this is back then, the official reserve report was a little bit less formal than it is now, but it was really the beginnings of the industry and looking for expertise and trying to become part of a team along with the producer in order to help them drill the best wells they can. And out of that, they continue to grow and grow and grow. And then kind of the business model, I think, more formalized to be predominantly around reserve certification, both here in Canada, US, and around the world. And we're coming up on 75 years here in 2030. Will be 75 years. And today, the original concept of the firm still holds true. Like, we have in-house reservoir experts that are going to work with you, with your team, to both help you certify reserves, but also help you develop better wells, buy better assets, etc. And we're really proud that the company still exists. We're really proud that it's still independently and privately owned. And we're hoping to continue for many years to come.
Did you ever meet Mr. Rod McDaniel?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't remember how many years, but the first number of years that I worked at McDaniel, he was still coming in every day. He hadn't officially worked for McDaniel, the firm, in over 20 years, I think, when I started. I think he was done in kind of the mid-80s around there. So by the time I started, he was 20 years removed from the firm, but still came in every day. And he had an office there. And one of the funny stories was, I don't remember what year it was, but somewhere around 2010, I'm going to guess, they stopped printing the daily oil bulletin, and they would literally print it and deliver it to our office every day. And when they stopped printing it, our receptionist had to start printing it at lunch every day for him. And then after a couple of years of that got a little annoying. So we finally asked Rod to, if he'd be okay if we installed a computer on his desk so that he could read the DOB at lunch. But yeah, he came into the office well into his late 80s, early 90s, and unfortunately passed a few years ago.
Some engineering companies come and go, but not all of them last roughly 70 years. Why do you think the company's lasted so long?
I think it comes back to that culture that I mentioned that Phil really hardened, I think, at McDaniel. But I mean, the other thing is ultimately we've got a role to fill, and there's little tangents off of that role that we take on sometimes. But I think we have an important role to fill in the market, and us, along with our main competitors, I think we've all been doing a good job of upholding that role and kind of staying in our lane for the most part, and ultimately building confidence with the market that if McDaniel says that this certain asset has this many barrels remaining or this range of outcomes that's possible, I think that that's broadly perceived to be a credible answer. And we strive hard to maintain our credibility in that space, as well build relationships with our clients. And so we just try to do the right thing every day and every year. And so far, so good.
To start at the top in terms of McDaniel and the business, how does McDaniel make money?
I'm going to guess here, but it's about 70% of our business, maybe 65% of our business is about year-end reserves certification. And that's what most people would know us for. And so the financial markets and the regulators expect that public producing companies in particular have to get their year-end reserves certified by an independent third party. And so that's us. And so we work with a number of companies in town here, and we go through, it's about a 6-month process for some of the larger companies where we go through all their existing producing wells, forecast the future production of those existing wells, and probably more importantly, forecast the undeveloped potential of their undeveloped lands. And so that's where you do a lot of type curve analysis, and we do a lot of analytics in that workspace and piece it all together. And ultimately the board of directors is the one responsible for hiring the evaluation firm, and we would get paid for that work, not dissimilar to kind of a financial auditor. And then the other 25-30% of our business, let's say, is more along the lines of buy-side advisory. Somebody's looking to purchase another asset. For example, the Chevron Duvernay assets are for sale right now. A lot of interest in that. So a lot of people interested in, of course, they have their own internal corp dev teams doing that work, but they also tend to come to us and say, hey, what do you guys think about this? Or can you look at that angle? And so we'll work up an asset like that in support of a purchase. And then ultimately, if they get to the finish line, they need a reserve report anyways, because the bank's going to want one, the investors are going to want one. So it's always about that kind of third party appraisal of an asset.
For the curious listener out there, what are oil and gas reserves, and why are they important to an energy company?
Oil and gas reserves would be the volumes of oil and or gas that are remaining underground in the reservoir, which are expected to be produced in the future, right? And so we always hear about production in quarterly reports and so on. This is really like if you've got 1,000 wells producing a total of 10,000 or 20,000 BOEs a day, what is the expected production profile for those 1,000 wells? That would be called the decline of those 1,000 wells. And also, what is the expected financial performance of that asset? We also drill into the lease operating statements and royalty costs, and we try to build out a future cash flow for the existing assets, commonly known as the PDP. That's not rocket science, frankly. I mean, you can do it wrong, certainly. You need to know what you're doing, but it's something over time that you get pretty good at, doing kind of the blowdown or the PDP reserves. I think where the art and the science comes in is in forecasting the undeveloped reserves. And so that's where we have undrilled sections of land, and we know there's oil and gas under there using all our geological mapping and tools. And that's where it becomes a bit more complex to try to understand, if I drill 50 wells in this field next year, what's the average performance I expect out of those 50 wells, and what's the capital cost going to be for that, and so on. And you roll it all up, you ought to be able to create ultimately a cash flow and a free cash flow profile for a business.
In simple terms, your widget might be how much oil and gas is there, when am I going to get it, and how much is it worth?
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And is it as good as I've been telling the market it is?
One of the traditional ways that reserve reports are done is a discount rate anywhere from 5, 10, 15 to 20%. But the markets the past few years have implied much higher rates now with low stock prices as a result. Do you agree with that? And how do you reconcile that difference when you're doing evaluations?
These days, if you look at some of our reserve reports, depending on what price deck you use, and you kind of look at the transactions that have been done, some of the bigger kind of Montney transactions, if you will, a lot of those transactions are happening around our 2P discount rate at about 20%. So 2P is kind of our proved and probable. That's our best estimate. Some people might see it as a little more of an aggressive look. We view it as our best, most estimate most likely. Conversely, you might just look at the proved estimate, which would be the conservative estimate. It's trading around NPV 10, give or take, depending on the price deck. Those have certainly gone up. And I mean, from my standpoint, they should go up. I mean, they should have gone up. I think there was a point in time when the valuation from the general market on companies was a little bit aggressive, in my opinion. And I'm very happy to see now that the market's really focused on free cash flow generation, free cash flow yields, which is, yield itself for me is not the right word for it, because yield implies that there's an underlying par value of 100. And in all of these companies, they all have declining assets, right? And so I'm encouraged that the market is super focused on free cash flow now. And I think what's to come next, and what I think the smart money in the market is focused on now, is not just depth of inventory, but what's the depth of quality inventory. And I think in the span of my career early on, reserves mattered a lot. People were buying bitumen assets for $1 a barrel. It was all reserves all the time, grow. And then let's say in the 2010s, nobody cared about reserves at all because it was deemed that we have so much of it. And people were just trading on cash flow multiples. And now I think, the market's wised up to, well, cash flow multiples don't work very good if you don't produce any free cash, obviously. So now at least we're trading on free cash. And I think the next shoe that's going to drop is, okay, free cash multiples are great, except how deep is your inventory again? And how long can you keep doing this? Because I'm starting to hear that maybe you guys don't have infinite inventory in these assets. And so it's funny, in about 20 years, it seems like now reserves are coming full cycle and they're starting to get a little more attention again.
If you were to normalize a reserve evaluation report to get it right from the source, is there a number you point towards nowadays? Maybe 20% like you mentioned, or?
That seems to be where the market is broadly trending on an asset that has lots of undeveloped inventory. I mean, certainly on more blowdown assets that have limited inventory, everybody seems to be trading just on a basic cash flow multiple less the abandonment liability. But, if you're looking at a large asset with large inventory, it seems like throw a reasonable strip-ish price deck against it, or maybe a reasonably flat forward price deck against it. And it tends to be around that NPV 20 on that price, which that's paying a lot for future inventory, frankly, right? Because a 20% rate of return does not generate very much corporate free cash flow, right? In fact, it probably generates nothing, right? And so that's the other thing that's changed a lot is we used to, for better or for worse, like a lot of people would use break evens of NPV 10 and stuff when they were saying whether or not to include a well in a forecast. Like a half cycle NPV 10 is not going to support the free cash flow expectations that investors have today, right? So that's where, when we talk about supply, we're super bullish on oil price, because we continue to see, frankly, degradation of performance in some of the big basins. And we think that the half cycle requirement to create the free cash flow engines that people want is much higher than most would admit.
As a leader of McDaniel, you see a lot of data on reserves across North America. If you were to put your finger on the largest resource that you are looking at right now, would you say it's the Montney? Others might point to the Permian. What, in your opinion, is the biggest?
By far, no debate, is SAGD. It's bitumen. I mean, it's the one that nobody seems to talk about very much anymore. And I mean, I've got a real hot take that I put out there 4 years ago that we'll be doing greenfield SAGD projects again in the next 10 years. And that was 4 years ago. So we've got 6 years to go. And when I said that, I meant large scale ones, where there's tons of SAGD expansion going on right now in Saskatchewan, small scale stuff, kind of in the little bit higher VISC world. But I mean, it's funny that how little press bitumen gets actually it's well over 3 million barrels a day, and nobody wants to talk about it. And, I think we believe that that's going to be a big play coming. Well, it already is a big play, but we think it's coming back largely because these other plays that our day to day, we spend more time talking about the Montney than anything else. Of course, all of our clients are super Montney focused. I love it. It's a great play, long legs. It's going to be here forever. It's got a lot of legs relative to a lot of the US plays. We also spend a lot of time on the Permian, but it's funny how little talk there is on bitumen these days.
Well, gas reserves are thousands of meters deep, aka there's a lot of room for error. Perhaps instead of saying what makes a good reserve report, what to you makes a bad reserve report?
A bad reserve report is one that doesn't recognize what's actually going on. So a bad reserve report is one where you go through your producing wells and because your type curve last year said that I expect this well to be 300,000 barrels, or let's say, and you go through, you're producing wells and they're underperforming your curve, but you find a way to convince yourself that the well is more hyperbolic. You know, there's all these different things that we use to forecast these wells, and you find a way to convince yourself, oh, it's gonna bend out later in time. And you go to you update your type curve analysis, and you start throwing out all the bad wells because you've got excuses why those wells are bad. And then of course your average becomes higher, and it's easy to get yourself into those positions. And so I think our role is often to go through and try to look at it with a pretty critical eye and say, are those wells bad? Yes. Are they bad for a reason? For sure. Is that something that is within our control and we can stop doing? Or is that within the statistical variance of the play to begin with, and we have to recognize it, right? And so it's pretty easy to convince yourself that things are always going to be a little bit better, especially if you've already set a mark in the sand and you need to live up to that. So sometimes it's not a lot of fun conversations, frankly, because we don't get it right all the time either, right? And so our curves are wrong sometimes, and we got to go in and sometimes we need to write them down, and those are not fun conversations, frankly. But I think that's one of the reasons we're still here almost 70 years later, is that, you know, you have to have those conversations. If you're not forward and honest about it in the moment, then they just get worse and worse, and then you're having a real bad conversation 2 or 3 years later.
The nature of the assets is that, like I mentioned, they're thousands of meters deep underground, so there's room for error.
For sure. I mean, especially, if we're talking about conventional reservoirs, we do about 20 or 25% of our overall business is outside of North America, and it's in conventional reservoirs all over the world, in Nigeria and Colombia and Kazakhstan and what have you. And I can tell you, in those types of reservoirs, there's a hell of a lot more room for error, because you're so heavily reliant on geological parameters that drive performance much more so than they do here in the so-called tight or shale plays. In Canada, though, yes, it's deep underground, but you know, we've got 100-year industry behind us to try to quantify the reservoir underground. And it is super important to the relative quality from one area to another. But I can say the uncertainty in the performance in, say, a new pad in the Montney, say in the middle of Kakwa or Carr or Pipestone or something, the uncertainty in that performance today is so much lower than what it was 30 years ago when we were talking about conventional reservoir, and even 10 years ago, largely because we have this large databases of wells now, and we have advanced analytics that help us determine why one well is different than another well. And it's still an imperfect science, but the certainty level over the last 10 years has gone up dramatically, I would say.
The critical investor might say the same company that's paying you to do the reserve reports is who you're making them for. How do you get around that conflict of interest or perceived conflict? There's
a couple things there. For one, the regulations say, like, obviously we can't own any part of the equity that we're working on. We incrementally to that at McDaniel, we just have a flat rule that nobody owns any oil and gas, like E&P equities, period. So that we're never like personally conflicted. But the main way is we work on a fixed fee. So there's no incentive for us to have a bigger number or some other bigger number. Now, obviously there's still conflict in the sense that if we have to deliver bad news, we need to write something down and the client's not happy. Are they more or less likely to stick with us? There's some inherent conflict there that is really hard to take to true zero. But I think for the clients that know me, and know our people here at McDaniel, like, I think that's part of what we're known for, is they don't care. They're going to say what they think no matter what. And if we lose a client over it, so be it. But I can tell you, in the last 10 odd years that I've been tracking it more closely, I don't think we've ever lost a client because they didn't like our opinion. In fact, I think it actually endears us to them because at the executive level, they don't always know, right, what's going on in the weeds. And so I think they look to us and say, thank God those guys are there, because I know they're never going to BS us, and they just say it like it is. And sometimes that is an extra layer of protection between the executive team and the operating teams themselves. So there's definitely room for some conflict there, but we're very, very serious about it here at McDaniel, because, again, back to one of my original comments, just kind of stay in your lane, do what you do, and do what you do really well, and try to be the best at that. And that's what we've been striving to do.
One of the reasons that conflict comes up is because banks lend on reserves, although they have been lending less lately. In your opinion, do you think banks should lend on reserves, and to what extent should they be lending on reserves?
Yeah, I definitely think they should be lending on reserves, in particular PDP. I think that's just part and parcel with the overall mood, I would say, of investors towards E&P companies right now. Those who are not in right now are sitting on the sidelines, and or the companies are not getting the valuations that they feel they deserve, all because of this kind of perception that this is not a long-term business or something silly like that. And so if I look at it and say, like, if I can mortgage my house, why can't I mortgage my PDP reserves, right? The idea that this is going away tomorrow is obviously silly. And so reserve-based lending, as much as it's a little bit out of favor at the moment, I don't think it's completely out of favor because of the industry. It's more out of favor, I think, luckily now that the producers simply don't need their debt like they used to need it, right? And even as recently as the last few months, we've seen some deals happen with significant reserve-based debt against them. So I expect as the market starts to value reserves and starts to value inventory again, as they realize that one, demand isn't really going away, and two, the supply is a little more scarce than people think, I think we're going to start to see more and more of that.
If you were to give a suggestion in terms of lending on reserves, would you say to stick to proved, and that perhaps that's your safe route?
The categories exist for a reason, right? The developed producing, the proved, and the probable, and I'll leave it to them to make that call. But if you're an investor, I will say this, like if you're expecting to buy an asset and turn a profit, and you accept the risk that comes along with that, I mean, you have to be looking at 2P and beyond. I think in order to get to the valuations that are meaningful here, especially for a large kind of undeveloped asset. If you're looking at an older asset that is, you're buying predominantly for the PDP and hoping to leverage it up and kind of survive the leverage and make your return that way, then obviously you're a little bit less concerned about that long-term life. But I think if you're buying an asset today in the Montney or the Permian or any of these types of plays, you better be focused on 10 plus year inventory. And I know it doesn't have significant value in your cash flow today, but if you're not buying an asset with that type of inventory, I'm not sure what you're going to be doing 3 or 4 years from now.
Just a quick thank you to one of our sponsors, and we'll be right back to the show. This podcast episode is sponsored by Connate Water Solutions. Do you need cost-effective water sourcing options to supply your next drilling or completions program? Connate Water Solutions is a specialized hydrogeology company focused on water well drilling, testing, and water management services in Western Canada and Texas. Contact info@connatewater.com or check out connatewater.com for more details. There's other companies that do reserve reports. How does McDaniel separate itself from competitors, and what makes the company different?
We kind of have 2 big competitors here in Canada, and there's 3 or 4 in the US that we compete with around the world. I think we all do a similar thing. And I think all 3 firms here in Calgary are pretty reputable as evidenced by their long-term nature. And so I certainly wish all those guys the best. I think where we differentiate is a couple of things. One is a few years ago, it was frankly, literally just a little bit on age, right? I took over in my mid-30s, and it was relatively young for a reservoir engineering firm, right? And I think we caught a little bit of flack for that. And it's not just me, like my partners they're even younger than me. So when this exec team took over, we were pretty young on a relative scale for this type of business. And I think there was some thought that might work against us, but I think it really worked for us, because as much as internationally and in certain basins, kind of the old school reservoir engineering 101 is still key here in Canada. I mean, I think something like 18 of 21 BCF a day is from modern horizontal wells, right? And if you think about SAGD, it really only started in 2002 in Foster Creek, right? So those of us, we've lived our whole careers with these types of assets, and we've seen it from day one. And I think that led to an approach from our end that was a little different than the other 2. And so one of those things is just, to what extent does data and analytics play into our evaluations? And these days it's heavy in everybody's evaluation, right? But 10 years ago, not everybody was doing that. And 10 years ago, we really started pushing that pretty hard. And, that's led to a spin out of a software company, a tool of ours called EVA. But in the meantime, in developing that tool, I think we developed a lot of credibility in the market in terms of, what's the right way to evaluate a Montney well? Can you really evaluate these 50 Montney wells without having evaluated the other 9,550? And so we coined a term about 10 years ago called value the play. Like, we don't value the company. Like, we value literally every well in the basin. And then when we come back to your asset for you, we're much better informed, right? And so I think that really helps set us apart. And then the other side, I mean, everyone's going to say this, but I truly believe it. I think client says jump and we say how high, and we're there for you no matter what. And I think the client service side of our business and the execution to deadlines, really, it sounds like table stakes, but it's something that we take extremely seriously. So I think the combination of a little bit new age analytics 10 years ago, what was new age, and just a real commitment to the client has made the difference for us.
On the subject of data analytics and technology, how is AI impacting McDaniel and how you go about the business?
Yeah. So AI, I kind of think of data analytics as kind of two parts. One part being, maybe even three parts. One part being just data itself and how do you prepare it? And second part, maybe having specialized tools like Eva to be able to number crunch the data. And then the third part is really, AI and machine learning. And so at McDaniel right now, we've got our chief data scientist as Tyler Schlosser, is a guy that him and I actually did an internship with over 20 years ago. And back then we were developing ML based tools to trade the stock market, like day trading when we were in university. And it's funny that now 20 years later, we've gone full circle and we're still working together. But now we're trying to use that same type of technology to help us decide, in this undeveloped section, what's this well going to look like? And even more importantly, if I can control all these different parameters about my well design, how does that change the outcome? And in the old days, like, you would drill the well and the best rock, and the uncertainty in the result was highly weighted to the geological uncertainty and limited exposure to how you drilled it or how you completed the well. Like if you think about drilling an old Leduc Reef or something, obviously there's some stuff that matter, but nowadays the geological uncertainty from section to section is relatively small. It's not small. It's not zero. You need to look at it, but on a relative basis, it's relatively small. But the operator now has 100 levers they can pull. Like I can drill my wells longer or shorter. I can frack them with tighter or wider cluster spacing. I can pump at 16 cubes a minute, or I could pump at 10 cubes a minute. I could use open hole, or I could use slotted line. And then probably the biggest one of all is the spacing right now, is how densely do we space these wells? So operators today have so many things they can control, and every one of those levers comes with a different outcome. And I can tell you, like in visual analytics, it's really hard to look at beyond kind of 3 or 4 dimensions. You can normalize for maybe length and plot this versus that, or you attempt to do it, but it falls pretty flat after 3 or 4 different dimensions. And that's where ML comes in. And so we use ML pretty extensively to help us determine what is the relative variance of this output, in this case, the well performance, as a function of this input, which I can control. And then if you combine that with a capital model that says, hey, tonnage costs me this much and drilling costs me that much, et cetera. And so you have a dynamic capital model, and now you have a dynamic performance model. We're with some of our clients, we'll run literally thousands of designs for a single pad and then run that under 4 or 5 different price decks. And it's crazy the amount of output you get. You're getting tens of thousands of economic outputs just for one entity. Obviously, any one of them isn't exactly correct, but it's really cool to see, well, I think this matters. Well, yeah, it does matter, but economically, it doesn't matter that much. And it really depends on an individual operator. Like, do you care about NPV? Do you care about rate of return? What do you care about? And so I'd say right now we're using ML predominantly for optimizing well design in that sense, but certainly there's no shortage of data in our business. And I think ML and even some of these large language models are really well suited to help us make better decisions in the future.
One way I have had it described to me is that you collect all the data and the language models basically come to conclusions quicker than it would have been for a human. I don't know if that's a good way to summarize it.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, I view it as like the language models do it quicker than a human, but I think a good ML model finds conclusions that you can't, because you can't think of a way to kind of normalize these 3 other variables or these 4 or 5 other variables in order to see the relative impact of the 5th or 6th or 7th most important variable. And I can tell you, like, it's human nature to focus on the variable that you think matters and then go find the data set that tells you that matters and then tell everybody that it matters. And ML doesn't have ML is objective. It doesn't have a horse in the race. So it sometimes just says, well, that's BS. Like, I mean, you think azimuth is the end all be all in the Montney? I disagree. It's just not that important. It's important, but it's not that important. Right. And so I'm picking on azimuth, but there's a bunch of different things like that. And that's where ML is great. It's kind of like the ultimate engineer. It just has no emotions.
Couple questions from Twitter. That's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Currently, companies are generally trading on the stock market in line with peers on cash flow multiples, not on asset value as determined by people like McDaniel, third-party reservoir engineers. So the question is, why is that?
Well, I think it goes back to, at least in my career, I can speak to, I think it goes back to the early 2000s when things were trading more on NAV, so net asset value. And, typically what that was by and large based on reserve reports plus some other. And a lot of people got burned, frankly, right? I mean, people bought on NAV, expecting NAV to come, and it didn't come. And it didn't completely happen all because of the report, but certainly 20 years ago, there's a lot of reports that were based on huge growth. I mean, that was the whole story, right? Everybody was going to grow. I'm going to grow 30%. Well, I'm growing 35, and everybody's going to grow. And so when that type of capital program is laid out, that's what we model in the reserve report as well, right? And, in some cases that actually did happen, like 7Gen, I remember when 7Gen IPO'd, our reserve report was 4% PDP, like insanely low portion of PDP, huge amount of growth. And, I'm happy to say in that case, it actually did come to fruition. Maybe not the entirety of the vision came to fruition, but what was in our reserve report did. But there was lots of them like that, right? And obviously, I think a lot of people got burned. So the market said, okay, well, what do I know for sure? Here's some cash flow, right? And I think they got burned on that too, frankly, because they forgot that this is a business where, at least at the time, 100+% was being reinvested to drill wells, right? And so some sort of EBITDA multiple didn't make a lot of sense. And so, like I said earlier, I'm encouraged to see that the market's a lot more focused on free cash flow now. What can this business really produce? And also, I think it's amazing and awesome that the producers have had the level of discipline they've had the last 3 or 4 years to not grow, right? Like, how common do you hear single digit growth? Like that's the standard now. And I think it's great because it's showing over the last 2 or 3 years in particular that this business is hugely profitable at these prices. And if we can just kind of hold the reins back a little bit, keep growth to a minimum, and just show my horse is better than your horse, or, my Ford is faster than your Ferrari type of concept, right?
Why do Canadian reserve evaluators continue to forecast price deck for companies versus the SEC approach of using future pricing?
Great question. I've tried for years to get them to change that. Honestly, I mean, we don't make our money off of forecasting prices. First of all, nobody has a really good forecast, and why would they believe ours? Like, we're trying to come up with a reasonable forecast based on kind of the regulations that are within COGI and within NI 51-101. And so we continue to do so, and we will continue to do so as long as we can. But frankly, from my point of view, whatever we can possibly do to more align our reporting with US standards makes sense, right? It's a huge pool of capital down there. They're confused by our forecast. They're confused by that stuff. I'm not one that is a proponent of that, but I only have one voice. And we did push pretty hard a few years ago at McDaniel to get, I don't know if you would be aware, but 3, 4, 5 years ago, ourselves and the other 2 large evaluators, we all have our own independent decks, right? And so it was even worse a few years ago in that, like, our clients would use the McDaniel deck, and the Sproul client would use a Sproul deck, and GLJ client would use a GLJ deck. And so not only were they forecasts different than the SEC, even within Canada, they were different than each other. Luckily, we pushed pretty hard from the McDaniel end to get our clients to say, hey, why don't we at least just average these 3 decks? Like, everybody's using one of these 3 decks. Let's just use the average of these 3 decks. So at least within Canada, it's comparable, right? But I'm with you. Let's get rid of it. Let's use the SEC deck because that's what people want to see.
On the subject of the states, the U.S. supply outlook, what are you seeing down there in terms of supply and demand?
Yeah. So 3 or 4 years ago, when I made my hot take that we're going back to, in a big way, to SAGD, it was based on that. We've been doing, I know this is kind of a common discussion these days, but 3 or 4 years ago, when we came out and said that, the Permian has about 10 years of decent inventory left. We literally got laughed at because, here's the EIA telling us that we have tons of oil. Like they're telling the market that all of their basins can hold flat for 30 plus years. And we just didn't buy it. And so, we went through and did a stick by stick, really detailed analysis of the big basins in the US. And well, certainly there's significant inventory remaining. Nobody's doubting that in all the major basins, Bakken, Eagle Ford, Permian, etc. But where our interest lies is there 20 years of supply? Is there 30 years supply? Is there 10 years of supply at these types of prices, right? And the background on this was we were looking and saying, well, if we think about the world in kind of 15-year chunks, where has that supply come from in the past? And so we went back 30 years and we looked, and world oil production has gone up almost exactly 1.1 or 1.2 million barrels per day per year, every year for the last 30 years, minus COVID, right? For the first 15 years, so go back to like the 90s to 2008, 100% of that growth came from outside of North America. The US declined. Canada went up by about 1.2. US went down by about 1.2. North America was flat. So about 15 million barrels, a little more than 15 million barrels a day of growth came out of the rest of the world. Since 2008, the rest of the world is flat, has not gone up at all. Canada's up another couple million barrels a day, a little engine that could, basically, all of which was SAGD, by the way. And a little bit of mining, I shouldn't say that, all of which was bitumen. And the US, of course, as we all know, grew dramatically to the point where you can easily say 100% of all oil production growth the last 15 years has been from the US. When you break that down further, so you start thinking, well, that's pretty important. I mean, we got two organizations with the same acronyms, the IEA is out there, which is clearly just a political organization now saying we simply don't need oil. It's a really silly organization. And then on the flip side, we got another organization, the EIA, saying, well, we've got, at least in the US, we've got tons of it. We've got 30 plus years of inventory in all of these basins. We think they're both wrong. We think we definitely do need oil. We're not demand experts, but I don't think you need to be a rocket scientist to see that oil demand keeps growing. And it's hard to imagine it's going to really slow down materially in the next 10 years, let's say. But on the flip side, on the supply side, I think we are experts. And when we look at that supply growth, Permian it's a huge, huge play. There's 50,000 wells drilled to date. They're drilling about 5,500 to 5,800, something like that per year. And it still grew last year by our math, about 300,000 barrels a day. I'm not here saying that we don't think the Permian can keep growing. We do. There's lots of inventory there. But the real question is, what is going to be the cost of that supply for the next 15 years? And by our math, the types of wells that are being drilled today that are resulting in the half cycle returns that are needed to drive the full cycle returns that investors expect, we've got it at less than 10 years in the Permian of that type of a well. And so if you're looking out, you're a big company and you're saying, well, I've promised 20 years flat, or maybe I'm Exxon and I've promised to double my production in the Permian, I think you're going to find, holy shit, I need some inventory, right? And where we're excited is that I think in the coming 2, 3, 4 years, we're going to start to see that almost all that's on the books already, right? So when we talk about reserves, like we typically book between 3 and 10 years of undeveloped inventory on the books. So as a company, it adds that 11th year. Those wells are much worse than the stuff they're drilling today. And finally, it's evident in every play that the wells originally aren't very good. Technology helps them get better. They figure out where to drill and how to drill them. And then near the end of the play, the wells all start to get worse. And we've seen that already in the Permian from our point of view, it peaked in 21. It got about 3%, 3 or 4% worse last year, and about 10% worse since 22 to 2023. And that's just a simple measurement of what's the 12-month cumulative oil per mile basically drilled. And we think that continues because there's two things happening. We're moving to crappier rock, frankly. We're moving away from some sweet spots. We're moving into crappier zones. And the other thing is, the bigger story, I think, is that density is finally catching up. And so as you start to drill more and more pads at higher net density with more and more parent-child interactions, that starts to seep in. And we're seeing that across every place. So a lot of words there, but I mean, the long story is that we don't think that those basins can supply at these prices for even 10 years. And so when the powers that be start to look and say, well, we've got 9 million barrels a day of production in the US out of these types of plays, 100% of the world's oil growth the last 15 years has been from those plays. In fact, 100% of the world's oil growth has been from the Permian alone since 2015. And if that thing starts to falter at all, I think that people, one, will obviously see a price reaction, but two, I think the powers that be start to look around and say, well, where else can we get this? And if you want a democracy and you want a, let's say, reasonably friendly trading partner, there's literally, to my knowledge, nowhere to go other than bitumen.
A lot of opportunity in Canada, but on the other hand, traditionally, it's been a bad idea to bet against American ingenuity.
Yeah. I mean, I would say this, when I started my career, everyone was producing good oil out of good rock. And then the oil sands came along, it's crappy oil out of good rock. And the shale came along, it was good oil out of crappy rock. And so is there a world where we start producing crappy oil out of crappy rock? And will there be a technology change or good oil out of even crappier rock, if you will? Like, that's probably the more likely scenario. And certainly I'm not going to sit here and say, no, that's not going to happen, because how many guys have called like a supply crunch and been wrong, right? Lots. But I'll say that I don't think the problem's never been this scale. 9 million barrels a day of this stuff. And the average well is getting worse in every play right now. And the only plays where it's not getting worse right now are plays where it's kind of artificial. I could show you some areas in the Montney and say, well, look at how good these new wells are. They're great, right? And they are. But they're so much better than the wells from a few years prior, mostly because a few years prior, they were massively over-drilled, i.e. way too much well density and massive well interference. And had you just used the same technology we have today, like 3-4 years ago, you would have also gotten an amazing well. And so from our point of view, like the big shifts in technology, at least with the current technology, the horizontal multi-stage, for the most part, we're at the S curve. Like, we think that the incremental gains from here forward in most plays due to completion alone are pretty minimal. And we're now more dominated by quality of rock that you're moving to and or the density at which you choose to develop the asset at. So is there another big technological shift coming? Probably. Is it going to come in the next 5 years and replace 9 million barrels a day? I don't think so. And I would go back and say, let's not forget about this giant resource we have in Alberta that, by the way, in the last 20 years, you can imagine we went from 0 to well over 1.5 million barrels a day in SAGD. Do you think they got better at it in that time? And I can tell you they did. And so why not apply the technology we already have to the reservoir that we have? And I think that it's going to happen, but people think I'm crazy. So we'll see.
How does the egress problem get solved in Canada?
Which one? Gas? Because, I mean, is there an oil egress problem at the moment?
Perhaps it is solved.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's solved. I mean, unfortunately, it's solved by the fact that we stopped building new projects, and therefore the pipe that we have is reasonably adequate to handle the production we have right now. Obviously, Trans Mountain coming on helps that as well. That should help us on our differentials a little bit. But I mean, for me, the big egress problem is gas, 100%. Like, it's truly insanity that we haven't built more LNG by now. And when I started my career, Montney just started by 2008, 9, 10. I can't remember how many projects were announced, but lots, 10 plus projects. And at the same time, the Australians were starting their thing. And, 5 years later, Australia is the number one LNG supplier in the world. And we're still arguing, right? And now 10 years later than that. And we're excited, of course, for LNG Canada to come on. And I think it's great, but I don't think we should pat ourselves on the back too hard, because at the same time, the U.S. has now since surpassed Canada, and these are material volumes. I mean, the entire basin is only about 20 BCF a day, right? So if we added 15 BCF a day of LNG like Australia had, can you imagine? My hometown in Dawson Creek would be pretty busy. So how do we solve it? Honestly, I don't know, but I think it starts with advocacy from our industry and being less apologetic and actually standing up and saying this is good, and creating a path that allows our politicians to be a little less aggressive than us, right? I mean, I think part of it was, I think industry was a little too nice, frankly, and a little too trying to meet everyone in the middle on a lot of different issues. And it's hard, I think, for politicians to get super aggressive and push things forward if industry themselves aren't aggressively pushing for things. And so I hope that industry continues to advocate, and hopefully with a little bit of government change, maybe we can actually get a real LNG industry going, because unlike the Permian, we do see long legs in the Montney. mostly not because it's bigger or badder. In fact, it's not as big, mostly because we just haven't drilled it. I mean, for reference, the Permian's 50,000 wells, give or take, and drilling about 5,500 a year. The Montney has only 10,000, almost 11,000 wells drilled in 20 years almost, and we drill about 900 a year. And so, like, if required, certainly the Montney could deliver a whole hell of a lot more gas than it is right now. It's just, it's stuck in a sandwich between what we can actually export and a couple other things. And that's one of the interesting things on the Montney. Like, it's about 11 BCF a day right now of 20 of the entire country. And if you add in this, what I call the Spirit River, the Deep Basin Cretaceous, that's about another 3.5, 4. And the rest of it is a whole bunch of old vertical wells that haven't been shut in, that are at very low decline. In fact, technically like zero decline the last 2 or 3 years. So there's a base wedge down there that is going nowhere. On the gas side, it's highly constrained, as evidenced by gas price right now.
Are you seeing opportunities in other commodities in Canada, like helium or lithium?
Yeah, I mean, I won't pretend to be an expert by any means. Certainly, we're doing some helium work with a couple of companies. It's pretty interesting. And again, no expert by any means, but happy to see that some small companies are able to take that same entrepreneurial spirit and get out there and drill for this stuff. And, you know, and on the lithium front, a little bit of exposure on it right now, but I will say that we're super focused on petroleum. We know that there's a lot of other markets out there. We know that there's a lot of other energy sources out there, but we kind of want to be known as the guys in the petroleum space, if you will. And so we try not to lose our focus very much. And we work on that stuff a little bit here and there, but for the most part, we're oil and gas all the time.
Biggest opportunity for McDaniel?
Biggest opportunity, I mean, from my standpoint, hopefully is that maybe 20 years from now, there's another president sitting here talking about the same stuff, and we're approaching our 100th anniversary, and the McDaniel name is still there, and it's still a fundamental part of kind of the industry here in Canada, but also abroad. And I truly believe that we're going to have a strong, thriving petroleum industry for at least another 20, 25 years. And I hope that the firm is just as strong then as it is now.
On the flip side, what keeps you up at night? What worries you?
Keeps me up at night, yeah.
Metaphorically.
From an industry standpoint, honestly, I don't know, not that much. Maybe I should be more worried about demand falling off a cliff or something like that. And should we have positioned the business for windmills or solar panels? And we haven't. But, you know, I think the main thing would be that I think it's super unlikely, but is that do we continue to see some political pressure that keeps Canada down and allows the rest of the world to fill the supply gap? And I mean, if something's going to blow up my hot take on SAGD, that'll be it, right? And so I'm hopeful, and I think that sea is changing right now a little bit, that the amount of outside pressure on our industry it's still there, but that I think the world and even our own citizens in Canada are kind of waking up to the fact that we need this stuff and it's good for our economy and our economy needs it. And I need a job and everybody needs a job. And so I'm hopeful that that's not the case. But I guess my biggest concern would be that demand goes exactly the way we all think it's going to go. It keeps rising 1 million barrels a day or so per year. And even maybe the U.S. does or doesn't have the resource to fill all that future growth, but that despite us having the resource, we blow up, we ruin the next 15 years the way that I think we may have kind of missed the opportunity the last 15 years. That would be the worst case scenario.
Among the other endeavors and initiatives you are involved in, you are also a chair of the Canadian Energy Executive Association. Maybe for the listener, what is that association and why is it important?
Yeah, so the Canadian Energy Executive Association, which is kind of known by its acronym CIA, is an organization that's been around for 73 years here in Alberta and was previously known as the Oilmen's Executive Association. We went through a name change almost 10 years ago now. And the goal of our organization is kind of threefold. We have a networking component where we're connecting different energy executives and their partners with each other, as well as we have a charitable component to our organization, where one of the big things we're doing right now is we have the CIA Education Fund, where we've been raising money to promote enrollment in petroleum and chemical engineering and geology and geophysics and those types of programs, as we've seen dramatic fall off in registrations for those programs, including, the loss of the oil and gas engineering program at U of C, which I'm happy to say looks like it's likely coming back. We've been working with U of C and I'm on an advisory committee for that. So we're hopeful that that's actually coming back. But the third leg of the stool there was charity and raising funds to support industry. And then the third one, and probably the most important one, is advocacy. And so we get together for a few events a year, a couple of business events here in Calgary, as well as our large conference in Banff coming up in August. And we get energy executives, government stakeholders, Indigenous, all sorts of different stakeholders in the energy industry. And we get them all in one room. We bring in a bunch of great speakers. This year we have former Prime Minister Stephen Harper as our keynote. We also have 3 premiers having a premiers panel, Premier Daniel Smith from Alberta, Premier Blaine Higgs from New Brunswick, and Premier Andrew Furey from Newfoundland and Labrador. So a little bit of conservative, a little bit of liberal, but also east-west angle there. And we kind of discuss the topics of the day and how can industry help to move things forward. And then another big part of our advocacy front is our, what we call Energizing Tomorrow. And that's our university outreach. And that's where a number of executives from within our organization, we have a board of about 30 governors who are just volunteers, executives from various producers, service companies, banks, etc. And we all volunteer our time to try to put on these events. And for the Energizing Tomorrow events, we visited, I think it was 6 universities this year, held in-person little mini conferences with the students talking about energy, not specifically petroleum, but petroleum, wind, etc., and just trying to have an open conversation with these university students about our industry and what we're up to and why it's important. And it's great, some of that hand-to-hand combat with those students really leads to some interesting conversations. And our goal is really to encourage those youth to either stay in the industry if they're already in the industry and or join the industry. And so we're really excited. My wife Deanna and I are the co-chairs this year. Really excited. Our big event is out in Banff at the end of August, and certainly any executives in the oil and gas business here in Calgary are certainly welcome, and they can find out more on our website.
If you were to leave a energy investor out there a message in terms of Canadian energy, what would you leave them with? What would you tell them?
I would tell them that we have some of the best supply in the world. We certainly have, I think, some of the best companies developing that supply, and that if you're long on petroleum in general, in your view of the world is long on petroleum, that there's simply no better place to be investing right now, right? I mean, we have great companies with great abilities. We have great service sector supporting those companies. We truly have world-class reservoirs that are sitting there either completely unexploited or underexploited. There's reservoirs out there that nobody's talking about anymore that are still just monster reservoirs that just need capital and need a little bit of political will. And we should continue to be a major player on the world petroleum market.
Well, that's an hour. We can
great
end the formal conversation there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Hello, listeners out there. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Hopefully the episode provided some insights. If you enjoyed the show, check out trose.ca where more episodes are yet to come. You can also subscribe to the podcast where your token of support is much appreciated. Until next time, happy coffee drinking.